We can hear you and see you.
Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about invasive weed impacts on native plants and wildlife in the changing climate. I'm Cheryl Shippentower, and I work for Department of Natural Resources in the Range, Ag, and Forestry. What I'm going to cover today is invasive weed impacts on native plants and wildlife habitat, as well as observed and predicted climate change impacts to invasive weeds and wildlife habitat, and then just briefly discuss what the tribe is doing with invasive weed management. First I'll start out with the invasive species have negative impacts on both native plants and wildlife. First of all, I want to kind of define what invasive weed is. It's a plant that causes economic loss and ecological damage, that creates health problems for both human and animals, and is undesirable wherever it's growing. So wildlife have co-evolved with native plant communities for forage, cover, and shelter, like was explained by Scott and Lindsay and Carl. So wildlife are unable to adapt rapidly to the changes of plant communities by invasive weeds. Like Scott had mentioned, that you see some reduction, reproduction is compromised, reduction in population growth, and then wildlife simply just leave or avoid those infested areas. So what I'm going to talk about is kind of the impacts to the plant communities or to the ecosystems, how invasive weeds alter the structure, organization, and function of those systems. And I'll provide examples of each of those and how they impact wildlife. So first of all, structure. Invasive weeds alter the composition of plant communities, displace native plants that change the physical structure of the plant community and wildlife community. So native bunch grasses and shrubs have been severely diminished by the invasion of annual invasive grasses. And so I'll talk about this first one. And all the examples I'll be giving are examples of weed species that grow on the reservation, within our region, within our seeded areas. So they impact all our resources that we depend on. So cheatgrass, as you can see in this photo, when we talk about the structure, it changes a community from the shrub, big sage plant community to a cheatgrass dominated community. And that influences the plant community and how wildlife use that. It also influences fire regimes. So cheatgrass burn, every 3 to 5 years compared to 20 or 100 years of native plants that they're replacing. Next, I'll talk about the function of native plants, that impact that weeds have on native plants. So a lot of annual grasses will accumulate litter, and that'll reduce seed and germination from native species. Like I mentioned, it'll alter historical disturbance cycles like fire. You'll see animal productivity reduce, so wildlife will avoid infested areas. Infested areas will act as physical barriers. Like some examples of that is like the invasive roads that we're seeing on our landscape here on the reservation. And then this invasive grass are just an undesirable forage for wildlife. The next is another annual grass. You can see that this is Medusa head, that it creates this thatch that doesn't allow any native plants to grow in that. And so it, you have low plant diversity in these areas, low value for wildlife habitat. And mule deer will frequent these Medusa mixed communities, but they won't forage on Medusa head. And so it's not very good forage value for them, these plant communities. Then next is the organization. So you'll see this alteration of the plant community it's kind of the interactions that occur. So you'll see competition from the invasive weeds where they release chemical into the soil that inhibits other. So this allelopathy that you'll see that it prevents native and other plants from growing in that. The seed production and dispersal and viability of invasive species is high. They have faster growth rates. They initiate growth before native species, and they exploit, the soil profile for moisture and nutrients. Is what, like Scott mentioned, is going to be a huge issue potentially in the future as climate changes. So in this next example, I'm going to talk about a sulfur cinquefoil, which is, we're treated on a reservation, but it's still widespread. It reduces biodiversity, reduces grass production by 60%. And it's not very good forage. Some studies have been done looking at, because it had this high tannin content in it, and wildlife utilization of this plant is less than 1%. And so what will happen is, livestock and wildlife will graze all the more desirable, and what is left is the sulfur cinquefoil, and then that just gives it the more competitive edge. And so I'll move on to talking about climate change and the potential, and I guess observed and potential that we'll see in the future with invasive weeds. So climate change and invasive weeds are the leading threat to ecosystems and biodiversity and ecosystem services, which are, for us, our first foods. And so I'll talk, okay. So success of invasive plants in native plant communities is highly influenced by the following factors. So the environment, so we're going to see potentially, well, we're already seeing increases in temperature and changes in our precipitation from snow to rain, increases of CO2, and disturbance, natural and man-made, and then propagal pressure, so how plant spreads, and then biotic resistance of our native communities. So we need these healthy, diverse native plant communities to resist the invasion of invasive species. So first of all, talk about rain shift, which is kind of what happens in the environment. A rain shift is you'll see plants moving polewards, so north, are upward in elevations, and this is a response due to warming. But we're already seeing this, but in the future, potentially we could have range expansion or contraction of invasive weeds, as well as native species. And these changes in environmental factors impact suitable habitat. So like Scott had mentioned, the higher elevations are ideal for wildlife. And if we see these invasive species moving higher, that's just going to reduce and contract that habitat further. And what they're predicting for the West is that yellow star, spotted weed, and cheatgrass are likely to expand their ranges in our area. Another one is weather-related movements and ecosystem disturbance. And Lindsay talked about this, about a disturbance, which is natural. Plant communities aren't stagnant. They're constantly changing. They're never the same because they've evolved with disturbance. But the severity and the frequency of these disturbance really has a negative impact on our plant communities and our wildlife resources. So species may be moving to new areas by climatic events such as floods. Extreme climate events play a role in invasion process. And so so all the things that make an invasive species have advantage, it's the introduction and transport. We're constantly spreading weeds, locally, regionally, globally. They establish very well, and their impact, they negatively impact our resources. They're really competitive. Like I said, they have strong dispersal abilities. They have rapid growth rates. They have a broad environmental tolerances, and then they may benefit from the change in precipitation and the increased levels of CO2. And then they still have advantage even with a fluctuation of resource availability. And this is the most important, bioresistance. We need to, like Scott said, maintain these priority areas, these for our resources, because of this constant disturbance, it's stressing our native species and ecosystems. And this may aid invasive weeds to decrease our native plant communities' resistance, this constant bombardment by disturbance, flooding, fires, even man-made stuff that, disturbances that are caused by us. And so what can we do? What is CTUIR doing to address invasive weeds and climate change? So in 2018, we developed an invasive weed management plan for the reservation. So we are actively managing invasive weeds. And then also we have our river and upland vision to address these issues. So here's a map I'd like to share. This is, so we do some surveying to kind of keep an eye, to monitor invasion on the reservation. So climate change was identified as an issue and a concern in our invasive weed management. So we've incorporated goals and objectives to, use adaptive management strategies as needed for addressing climate change to native plants and invasive weed coverage on the reservation due to climate change, and then monitor those, identify changes to native plant invasives. And then within this, we have we've identified strategies to address it. So education, prevention, inventory, like this map I've shown, identifying priority invasive species to treat, and priority management areas specifically for the protection of our first foods, and then monitoring to see how effective those management strategies are.
1 minute.
And so, okay, that's perfect. So I'll just end with that we'll use these guiding documents as management strategies, to kind of, this guiding document describes desired ecological processes and characteristics for first food resources. And so we need to develop, it proposes a management strategy for us to incorporate so that we protect the values and needs of the tribal community, which is our first foods. This is but thank you. And like Lindsay said, if you have any questions, I can answer them in that discussion portion of this. And I'll stop sharing my presentation and we can move on to the next presenter.